Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Town meeting of the LaRouche Organization. This meeting is entitled Leaving Afghanistan and Returning to Reason. As in William Shakespeare's late drama, The Tempest, the United States, and the whole transatlantic world, in fact, is being tossed on a troubled sea at the end of a 20-year arrogant mistake. The secular religion of geopolitics condemned us to this 20-year loss of human life, wealth, and time. But it goes back farther than that. For example, Henry Kissinger's May 1982 declaration, not of independence from, but allegiance to the British Empire, made on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the founding of British intelligence in London, in which he talked about how he kept the British Foreign Office better informed than the U.S. State Department, is one example. It was Zbigniew Brzezinski's 1979 invention of the Islamic fundamentalist card, which provoked the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, about which Brzezinski boasted in 1998. But in fact, he'd been put up to that by British intelligence agent Bernard Lewis. He'd really plagiarized his Islamic fundamentalist card from Lewis's Ark of Crisis. So the problem of the United States and the problem of the United States policy has been that we've veered from one geopolitical adventure, such as in Southeast Asia in Vietnam. We went right from there into Southwest Asia and Afghanistan, not yet with our own troops, but instead with the devious and so-called ingenious use of Islamic fundamentalism, which we, in fact, promoted, armed, and diversified into terrorist forces through both Pakistan, Afghanistan, and that area of Southwest Asia. The murder and the mayhem at the center of that geopolitical scene finally then came home to the shores of the United States, first in 1993, the first bombing of the World Trade Center, and then September 11th, 2001, the assaults there in Pennsylvania and in the Pentagon. 20 years later, lives, treasure, and time have all been lost. We've been burnt by fire. We've been blinded in our sight. We're lost in a kind of rage and ire at what has happened and a great confusion. Now, we're here today to talk about an antidote to all of that. It starts with the citizen, returning to the true nature of the American Revolution as that was prosecuted by Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton, and shaped into the American presidency and the presidential system. Lyndon LaRouche, who campaigned for president over a period of 3 and a half decades, talked about the fact that he did this not because he wished to merely get elected, but because he was the only person he thought and he knew of that actually understood the nature of this system. And he talked about the idea of how citizens have to be qualified in their own minds to understand how a presidency works. What we're going to do is we're going to show a video of LaRouche addressing the question of the presidency, but from the standpoint of classical culture. And before we do that, we're going to refer to a work he wrote in 1982 called The Toynbee Factor in British Grand Strategy. He was referring to British intelligence agent and historian Arnold Toynbee, who back in the 1950s, 60s, and so on was a major presence in American academic life. LaRouche said, in a properly ordered republic, as the forces around Benjamin Franklin and George Washington understood this point correctly, the single greatest source of potential danger to the republic is the very sort of estrangement of the citizen from rational comprehension of national policy issues which prevails in the United States today. The most essential thing for a republic to develop a citizen into an adult is to develop, a citizen into an adult with the qualities of a true citizen. These qualities subsume the ability of the citizen to focus upon and comprehend in a rational way the great issues of national policy. The entire history of modern civilization demonstrates that such qualities of citizenship can be cultivated in people in only one manner. That manner is a teaching of classical literary culture, classical musical culture, classical principles of plastic arts composition, and classical principles of scientific thinking, all situated within the frame of reference of a comprehension of national and world history as a process of universal history. When the proper acquaintance with Shakespeare was ripped out of our school's curricula, what our nation lost was persons adequately developed to become the future citizens of this republic. Without Shakespeare, Milton, and Shelley in our secondary schools, those schools will produce chiefly eternally adolescent, functional illiterates or worse. This importance is not because of the fame of those authors as such, but because these works represent a distillation of those aspects of our English-speaking culture by means of which true citizens are produced. We're going to be showing you in our video, Linda LaRouche discussing the American presidency, but from the standpoint of William Shakespeare, and in specific, Shakespeare's Hamlet.
A president is not really much. A president is only the chief executive officer of the United States, which is a very important position. But that's not the cure-all for anything. The question is, having become the chief executive officer, what's he going to do? Is he going to be a leader of a nation, or is he going to be a guy holding onto a prize called the presidency as something he won in a raffle called a national election? Because he's like Hamlet. Hamlet could have saved the nation of Denmark, but he failed to do so. So the story is not a story about how Hamlet failed or succeeded in becoming successful. He wanted to die, he was successful. The story is about a man who was in a position of leadership, upon whose leadership the fate of his nation depended. And he sank like a sinker and took the nation with him because he was a fool. What did he say? You go to the two famous soliloquies in Shakespeare's Hamlet, which get to the heart of the problem, which is the heart of what we're going to be addressing in these 2 days here. He's had a rehearsal of this group of traveling players. And as the players leave, and then his two cronies leave, he stands alone and he says, "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I, that this actor here could make such a show of passion for nothing, for Hecuba." What's Hecuba to him? Or he to Hecuba? What would he do if he had the cause and cue for passion, which I have? He would drown the state with tears. And yet I peak like John of Dreams and can do nothing but for my cause. Man who's incapable of acting when he has great motivation and cause to act. A man in a leading position who can shape the future of his nation stands speaking like John of Dreams, unpregnant of his cause, doing nothing, with no passion to do anything to save his nation from a catastrophe. You say, now what's this all about? The curtain falls on that soliloquy. Then Act 3 opens, and you have this prostitute, sort of like an Anne Boleyn of the drama, Ophelia. Ophelia is being used like a prostitute by the king and by her father to attempt to manipulate and handle Hamlet in the way in which Anne Boleyn, the strumpet of the Howard family, was used to manipulate Henry VIII. An image which was very much in the mind of Shakespeare at that time. So there's a meeting of these guys. I've invited Hamlet to come. Ophelia, you're going to be reading a book, Walking Along the Path, in a second. And Hamlet is aware of this. His insults to Ophelia, comparing her to a strumpet, afterward reflect that understanding. So he's not crazy in calling Ophelia a strumpet and telling her to get to a nunnery and save her soul. What does he say about himself? He speaks in the subjunctive, the real subjunctive. To be or not to be. Those terms are in the subjunctive. They're not in the indicative mood. They're in the subjunctive mood, which people who follow Hobbes and empiricism don't believe in. To be in what? There are two states. One is the state of knowing, the tradition which is going to guide you in your action. The other is a new way of thinking, or a different way of thinking, which violates your tradition, by which you might survive. You are certain that if you follow tradition, you are doomed to be or not to be. What's the issue? The issue is, this is like death. Death is an experience from which no one has returned. And to change my idea, to change my axioms of belief, is to me like death. It's uncertainty. It's the unexplored, the unexpected. I would rather bear the ills I have and die than go into this strange area of new things, contrary to tradition, and live. And so he walked to the end of the drama into an orgy of death, which he knew he was walking into like an existentialist, because he refused to admit that what he assumed to be beforehand, the right way of thinking, was the only way of thinking which he could accept. And he would rather die than change that.
So which will America choose? Afghanistan need not necessarily be merely a nightmare from which we retreat. It can actually be a pathway out of the nightmare that has become American life, if we realize that war has to be replaced by reason. To discuss this, to begin the discussion of this process, we're going to have, and actually I guess we should bring everybody up initially, Harley Schlanger, who people know very well, who have been following by either Executive Intelligence Review or all of the other activities of this organization in the past year. Carl Osgood is from our desk, our defense desk, if you want to call it that. You can call it offense desk also at Executive Intelligence Review. And Diane Sayre, who's a co-host today and is going to be speaking to us in particular about an element of what we'll be doing around the 9/11 memorial commemorations that will be happening later on this week. So Harley, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. That passage from Lynn really defines what I want to talk about today. This idea of to be or not to be, two completely different directions with the possibility of destruction or salvation, of transformation. We're in that mode right now where there are two absolutely irreconcilable directions in which U.S. policy could go. The decision made by President Biden to pull out of Afghanistan, to withdraw the troops, was absolutely correct and essential, a necessary action, which, and in doing so, he was following something which had been the campaign theme of President Trump in 2016, ending the endless wars. We had been in a 20-year destructive process of ongoing war. And there are two ways you can deal with this. The first is you could recognize the error in strategic direction which led us into that 20-year war, into the endless wars, and recognize that an alternative does exist, an alternative to move ahead with cooperation for economic development, working with other great powers to bring about a development process, not just in Afghanistan, but in the whole of Southwest Asia. And it's the cooperation for economic development, which itself would be the transformational issue. Now, behind that, there are other things that would have to be done. One, reject geopolitics, the imperial geopolitics that Dennis was mentioning about Brzezinski, Kissinger, and others, which led us into these wars. End the neoliberal policies, which have made much of the world a wreckage heap without economic development, without clean water, without electricity, without the modern conveniences which are absolutely essential to sustain a population of 7.5 billion people. To fulfill the post-World War II goal of Franklin Roosevelt, to end once and for all British colonial policies. And in doing so, cooperate in great projects of economic development that are mutually beneficial. That's one direction we could go in right now. And it would be based on applying LaRouche's four-power agreement to the global strategic alignment. Now, the second direction, which we're hearing from a number of people in the Biden administration, and we're also hearing from Biden opponents among neoconservative Republicans, is shift the venue of endless wars. Now, some of the neocons are saying we should stay in Afghanistan, as though there's a military solution there. But more importantly is the message which is coming out saying shift the venue away from Southwest Asia to two other immediate hotspots. One, Ukraine and the Black Sea, and secondly, the Indo-Pacific region, particularly the South China Sea and Taiwan. To continue to expand NATO, to include Ukraine and Georgia, to carry out regime change in Belarus and bring Belarus into NATO, to create a Pacific NATO, which is part of the policy that's this other alternative. Now, these are two mutually contradictory policy orientations, and they reflect the differences between the American system and the British system. Now, President Biden deserves credit for making the decision to withdraw. And he said in his speech to the nation after the US troops were out, after the last plane had left, he said, "We are now ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. No more nation building. No idea that we're going to go in and protect people from so-called authoritarian regimes." But at the same time Biden said that, you still have from his administration and from himself statements which show the old orientation, the idea that we're going to punish those people who we don't agree with that are still in Afghanistan, that we're going to withhold funds at a moment of profound economic misery in Afghanistan. The Federal Reserve is going to hold on to Afghans' funds in American banks, and the International Monetary Fund is going to refuse to extend the special drawing rights which they need to buy food, medicine, and other necessities. There also was a pronouncement by Biden that we will continue to move our forces to confront China in the Indo-Pacific region. And he met with President Zelensky from Ukraine and praised the idea of the Crimea platform, by which Zelensky means challenging Russia by militarily taking back Crimea. Again, this is a policy which is absolutely contradictory to ending regime change wars, to ending the unilateralism which characterized the plunge into the last 20 years of endless wars. Now, the underlying issues posed in these contradictory outlooks is sometimes looked at in very banal terms. For example, we should learn from our mistakes. Well, I think the catastrophe of the endless war scenario is that it's not the result of mistakes. It's the result of deliberate policy, of a strategic objective, which goes against the interests of the American Republic, as well as against the interests of the people that we're trying to free or protect under the responsibility to protect doctrine. It's based on the idea of unilateralism, that the US has a right to use its military power to impose so-called Western values. Now, we can get into a discussion later of those Western values. Do they include drug liberalization laws? Do they include economies that force millions of people into prostitution, into slave labor to stay alive? Are those Western values? Well, the idea that we can impose democracy itself is a contradiction. As Dennis was making the point, if citizens are not elevated to the point where they will fight for their sovereign rights, you can't impose a system of government on them, as we should have seen from these last 20 years. What about the free market and deregulation policies, the austerity policies imposed by the global bankers? Are those Western values? And we look at the Great Reset, which is essentially an attempt to set up a global central banker dictatorship of permanent austerity. For what reason? To defend the debt bubbles that have been built up with quantitative easing and so on. And the Green New Deal, a policy which will ensure that more than half of the world's population will likely die from lack of food, lack of electricity, lack of clean water, because the policy of reducing energy flux density, as we've pointed out repeatedly, is a Malthusian policy which will destroy the productive powers of populations to reproduce themselves. So if these are the policies of the rules-based order, they must be rejected, and they have been rejected by much of the world. So what's the problem that we have? Well, the only way that these policies can ultimately be imposed for the benefits of Wall Street, the City of London, the Davos billionaires, will be permanent warfare, leading to an inevitable nuclear war. You cannot impose these policies from the top down. That's the lesson we should take from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. That in order to impose something like this from the top down, you end up destroying what's left of the dignity of people and their ability to feed and clothe and provide health care for themselves. There's no military solution. This was the underlying reality that Lyndon LaRouche addressed with the Strategic Defense Initiative. The military solution of the mutual and assured destruction is mutual and assured destruction. There's no military solution. You have to move outside of that framework, which is what the Strategic Defense Initiative was, bringing in new physical principles that will now allow nations to collaborate and work together based on higher economic principles, higher productivity and collaboration, as opposed to scrambling and struggling for a bigger piece of a shrinking global pie. Now, add to this the talk of defending people from authoritarian regimes, so-called authoritarian regimes. The idea of a global central banking dictatorship is an authoritarian policy. What's being proposed with the Great Reset makes the schemes of the world communist movement and the Nazis look mild in comparison. So when you talk about authoritarianism, you have to start with the idea of the necessity to defend the right of nations to their sovereignty, to having governments that will act in the interests of the population, what we called in our Constitution the general welfare, and do that from the bottom up, from having a citizenry that will fight for that, as opposed to imposing from the top down dictatorial policies that defend the wealthiest of the bankers and financial cartels and corporate cartels while casting the rest of humanity on a human scrap heap. Now, for them to succeed, they have to engage in mass brainwashing, controlling the narrative, using censorship to keep other ideas out, the surveillance state. This is the modern Anglo-American imperial system, with global Britain, the new form of the British Empire, allegedly being created to make sure the United States remains trapped inside the special relationship, which is why we were in these 20 years of war. Now, many people know that our republic is under attack. Many people don't like it. But the problem is they're being steered into dead ends by the people who are pushing to do this. We have the division between so-called left and right, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, arbitrary views of freedom. All of these things are imposed from the top down, from our education system, from our media, which is another cartel. And this is the source of the tragedy. The fact that the citizenry is not engaged in the kind of dialogue that's necessary to uplift the average citizen from someone who's just reacting to oppression into being a knowledgeable person who can participate in the revival of the American system. That's why Lyndon LaRouche was attacked. The key to LaRouche's campaigns was to elevate citizens, to present alternatives that are not simply a laundry list of proposals, but are based on providing creative solutions that require creative citizens to act. Now, I just want to take a minute to show what I think is an example of the Hamlet problem that Lynn was talking about. I'm not saying the person I'm about to introduce you to is a Hamlet, but you can see the problems in his understanding of the situation versus what he's done throughout his career. And I'm talking about a man named William Burns, who is currently the CIA director in the Biden administration. After more than 3-decade career in the State Department, serving under 5 presidents, did some good things in his diplomatic work, including as a period of ambassador to Russia, including his role in the Middle East and some of the negotiations. But as he admits in his book, which is called The Back Channel, there were many times he disagreed with policies, including Iraq, including Syria, where he sent a memo or two to his superiors, but didn't act. He went along with the policy. And part of it was, you see the expression of this in his admiration for people like James Baker, who was the consigliere of the Bush regimes, and who was very much involved in the policies that became this unilateral, constant war policy. His admiration for Colin Powell. Everyone knows Colin Powell knew he was lying when he went before the UN General Assembly with the documents which claimed to show Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. So keep in mind the person I'm talking about has gone along with policies which he knew were wrong. But listen to the conclusion of his book. And keep in mind that the last chapter in his book was his role as a back channel to Iran during the negotiations for the Joint Comprehensive Program of Agreement. That is the ending of Iran's nuclear program and the lifting of sanctions, which would have been the ultimate effect of it. Here's what Burns said. America's unipolar moment was, by definition, temporary. Inevitably, our relative power would diminish as other players became wealthier, stronger, and more assertive. In the midst of these dramatic geopolitical shifts, some of which we accelerated with our own mistakes, we lost our way in diplomacy. At first lulled by the experience of the post-Cold War dominance, and then shocked by 9/11, we gradually devalued our diplomatic tools. All too often, we over-relied on American hard power to achieve policy aims and ambitions, hastening the end of American dominance, deepening the desire and capacity of our adversaries to upend the American-led international order, and disillusioning the American public. A little later, when he's talking about how diplomacy matters more than ever for America, he writes, "The window for defining a strategy for a changing international landscape and America's pivotal role is slowly closing, but it is by no means shut. That strategy will require a new compact on diplomacy, one that reinvests in diplomacy's core functions and roles, adapts smartly to new challenges and realities, and reinforces the connection between leadership abroad and rejuvenation at home." And I'll conclude these quotes with the following, and I want you to listen to this carefully because it's really, to me, was quite a revelation to find someone who's now the CIA director doesn't share the outlook of previous CIA directors, including people like Brennan and Gina Haspel. Burns writes, "The militarization of diplomacy is a trap which leads to overuse or premature use of force and underemphasis on non-military tools. In Iraq and Afghanistan, diplomats found themselves slipping into supporting roles in the military's counterinsurgency strategy, preoccupied with local social engineering and the kind of nation-building activities that were beyond the capacity of Americans to accomplish. It sometimes seemed as if we were trying to replicate the role of the 19th century British colonial service, not play the distinctive role of the American Foreign Service," unquote. If he understands that, will he be a silent voice if the decision is made by the Biden administration to adopt an Asian pivot strategy which puts us on a course toward war with Russia and China, a war which serves nobody's interests except the broader military-industrial complex and its allies in the global banking and corporate cartels? If he really understands that we were in a direction of the 19th century British colonial service, will he step forward to change that? Now, this is not just about him, it's about the American people. Knowing what we know, what we've been presenting, what the LaRouche movement has been developing for years, largely due to the work of Lyndon LaRouche and now Helga Zepp LaRouche, will the American public demand an end to this British system that has been plunging the United States into catastrophic wars, depression, and weakening our survivability by privatizing healthcare, giving a green light to globalization and the damage that's done by that? That's the issue of Hamlet. And it's not just for people like William Burns to think about. It's for every single one who's listening to this meeting tonight and every single person that you know to break out of this role of Hamlet into the role exemplified by people like Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Lincoln, and Lyndon LaRouche. So thank you, Dennis. That's what I wanted to say in the opening.